So tonight I'm going to read from a book entitled An Unentangled Knowing, which is by Upāsikā Kee Nanayon. And the two talks I've chosen are quite different from each other. So I'll give a brief introduction about Upāsikā Kee. Upāsikā Kee Nanayon, also known by her pre-name Khe Khao Swan Luang, was arguably the foremost woman Dhamma teacher in 20th century Thailand. Born in 1901 to a Chinese merchant family in Rajburi, a town to the west of Bangkok, she was the eldest of 5 children, or, counting her father's children by a second wife, the eldest of 8. Her mother was a very religious woman and taught her the rudiments of Buddhist practice, such as nightly chants and the observance of the precepts from an early age. In later life, she described how, at the age of 6, she became so filled with fear and loathing at the miseries her mother went through in being pregnant and giving birth to a younger sibling, that on seeing the newborn child for the first time, quote, sleeping quietly, a little red thing with black hair, quote, end quote, she ran away from home for 3 days. This experience, plus the anguish she must have felt when her parents separated, probably lay behind her decision made when she was still quite young, never to submit to what she saw as the slavery of marriage. During her teens, she devoted her spare time to Dhamma books and to meditation, and her working hours to a small business to support her father in his old age. Her meditation progressed well enough that she was able to teach him meditation with fairly good results in the last year of his life. After his death, she continued her business with the thought of saving up enough money to enable herself to live the remainder of her life in a secluded place and give herself fully to the practice. Her aunt and uncle, who were also interested in Dhamma practice, had a small home near a forested hill, Khao Swan Luang, Royal Park Mountain, so that was her pen name, outside of Rajburi, where she often went to practice. In 1945, as life disrupted by World War II had begun to return to normal, she gave up her business, joined her aunt and uncle in moving to the hill, and there the 3 of them began a life devoted entirely to meditation. The small retreat they made for themselves in an abandoned monastic dwelling eventually grew to become the nucleus of a women's practice center that has flourished to this day. Life at the retreat was frugal, in line with the fact that outside support was minimal in the early years. The women practicing in this center met daily for chanting, group meditation, and discussion of the practice. In the years when Upāsikā Kee's health was still strong, she would hold special meetings at which the members would report on their practice, after which she would give a talk touching on any important issues that had been brought up. It was during such sessions that most of the talks recorded in this volume were given. In the center's early years, small groups of friends and relatives would visit on occasion to give support and to listen to Upāsikā Kee's Dhamma talks. As word spread of the high standard of her teachings and practice, larger and larger groups came to visit and more women began to join the community. When tape recording was introduced to Thailand in the mid-1950s, friends began recording her talks, and in 1956, a group of them printed a small volume of her transcribed talks for free distribution. By the mid-1960s, the stream of free Dhamma literature from Khao Swan Luang, Upāsikā Kee's poetry, as well as her talks, had grown to a flood. This attracted even more people to her center and established her as one of the best-known Dhamma teachers, male or female, in Thailand. Upāsikā Kee was something of an autodidactic. Although she picked up the rudiments of meditation during her frequent visits to monasteries in her youth, she practiced mostly on her own without any formal study under a meditation teacher. Most of her instruction came from books, the Pali Canon, and the works of contemporary teachers, and was tested in the crucible of her own relentless honesty. Her later teachings show the influence of the writings of Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, although she transformed his concepts in ways that made them entirely her own. In the later years of her life, she developed cataracts that eventually left her blind, but she still continued a rigorous schedule of meditating and receiving visitors interested in the Dhamma. She passed away quietly in 1978 after entrusting the center to a committee she appointed from among its members. And it was her younger sister who eventually took over leadership, Upāsikā Wan. So this is a talk entitled Breath Meditation Condensed. And just want to warn you, Upāsikā Kee does not pull her punches There are lots of people who are ashamed to talk about their own defilements, but who feel no shame at talking about the defilements of others. Those who are willing to report their own diseases, their own defilements, in a straightforward manner are few and far between. As a result, the disease of defilement is hushed up and kept secret so that we don't realize how serious and widespread it is. We all suffer from it, and yet no one is open about it. No one is really interested in diagnosing his or her own defilements. We have to find a skillful approach if we hope to wipe out this disease. And we have to be open about it, admitting our defilements from the grossest to the most subtle levels, dissecting them down to their minutest details. Only then will we gain from our practice. If we look at ourselves in a superficial way, we may feel that we're already fine just as we are, already know all we need to know. But then, when the defilements let loose with full force as anger or delusion, we pretend that nothing is wrong. And in this way, the defilements become a hidden disease, hard to catch hold of, hard to diagnose. We have to be strong in fighting off defilements, cravings, and illusions of every sort. We have to test our strength against them and bring them under our power. If we can bring them under our power, we can ride on their backs. If we can't, they'll have to ride on our backs, making us do their work, pulling us around by the nose, making us want, wearing us out in all sorts of ways. So are we still beasts of burden? Are we beasts of burden because defilement and craving are riding on our backs? Have they put a ring through our noses? When you get to the point when you've had enough, you have to stop. Stop and watch the defilements to see how they come into being and what they want, what they eat, what they find delicious. Make it your sport, watching the defilements and making them starve, like a person giving up an addiction. See if it gets the defilements upset. Do they hunger to the point where they're salivating? Then don't let them eat. No matter what, don't let them eat what they're addicted to. After all, there are plenty of other things to eat. You have to be hard on them, hard on yourself, like this. Hungry? Well, go ahead and be hungry. You're going to die? Fine, go ahead and die. If you can take this attitude, you'll be able to win out over all sorts of addictions, all sorts of defilements, because you're not pandering to desire. You're not nourishing the desire that exists for the sake of finding a flavor in physical things. It's time you stopped, time you gave up feeding these things. If they're going to waste away and die, let them die. After all, why should you keep them fat and well fed? No matter what, you have to keep putting the heat on your cravings and defilements until they wither and waste away. Don't let them raise their heads. Keep them under your thumb. This is the sort of straightforward practice you have to follow. If you have endurance, if you put up a persistent fight until they're all burned away, then there's no other victory that can come anywhere near. No other victory that's anywhere near a match for victory over the cravings and defilements in your heart. This is why the Buddha taught us to put the heat on the defilements in all our activities, sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. If we don't do this, they'll burn us in all our activities. If you consider things carefully, you'll see that the Buddha's teachings are all exactly right, both in how they tell us to examine the diseases of defilement and in how they tell us to let go, destroy, and extinguish defilement. All the steps are there, so we needn't go study anywhere else. Every point in his doctrine and discipline shows us the way, so we needn't wonder how we can go about examining and doing away with these diseases. This becomes mysterious and hard to know only if you study his teachings without making reference to doing away with your own defilements. People don't like to talk about their own defilements, so they end up completely ignorant. They grow old and die without knowing a thing about their own defilements at all. When we start to practice, when we come to comprehend how the defilements burn our own hearts, that's when we gradually come to know ourselves, to understand suffering and defilement, and learn how to extinguish defilement gives us space to breathe. When we learn how to put out the fires of defilement, how to destroy them, it means we have tools. We can be confident in ourselves, no doubts, no straying into other paths of practice, because we're sure to see that practicing in this way, contemplating inconstancy, stress, and non-self in this way at all times really gets rid of our defilements. The same holds true with virtue, concentration, and discernment. There are tools, and we need a full set. We need the discernment that comes with right view and the virtue that comes with self-discipline. Virtue is very important. Virtue and discernment are like our right and left hands. If one of our hands is dirty, it can't wash itself. You need to use both hands to keep both hands washed and clean. So wherever there's virtue, you have to have discernment. Wherever there's discernment, you have to have virtue. Discernment is what enables you to know. Virtue is what enables you to let go, to relinquish, to destroy your addictions. Virtue isn't just a matter of the 5 or 8 precepts, you know. It has to deal with the finest details. Whatever your discernment sees as a cause of suffering, you have to stop. You have to let go. Virtue is something that gets very subtle and precise. Letting go, giving up, renouncing, abstaining, cutting away, and destroying. All of these things are an affair of virtue. This is why virtue and discernment have to go together, just as our right and left hands have to help each other. They help each other wash away defilement. That's when the mind can become centered, bright, and clear. These things show their benefits right at the mind. If we don't have these tools, it's as if we had no hands or feet. We wouldn't be able to get anywhere at all. We have to use our tools, virtue and discernment, to destroy defilement. That's when our minds will benefit. This is why the Buddha taught us to keep training in virtue, concentration, and discernment. We have to keep fit in training these things. If we don't keep up the training as we should, our tools for extinguishing suffering and defilement won't be sharp, won't be of much use. They won't be match for the defilements. The defilements have monstrous powers for burning the mind in the twinkling of an eye. Say that the mind is quiet and neutral. The slightest sensory contact can set things burning in an instant by making us pleased or displeased. Why? Sensory contact is our measuring stick for seeing how firm or weak our mindfulness is. Most of the time it stirs things up. As soon as there's contact by way of the ear or eye, the defilements are very quick. When this is the case, how can we keep things under control? How are we going to gain control over our eyes? How are we going to gain control over our ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind? How can we get mindfulness and discernment in charge of these things? This is a matter of practice, pure and simple. Our own affair, something by which we can test ourselves to see why defilements flare up so quickly when sensory contact takes place. Say, for instance, that we hear a person criticizing someone else. We can listen and not get upset. But say that the thought occurs to us, she's actually criticizing me. As soon as we conjure up this me, we're immediately angry and displeased. If we concoct very much of this me, we can get very angry. Just this fact alone should enable us to observe that as soon as our self gets involved, we suffer immediately. This is how it happens. If no sense of self comes out to get involved, we can remain calm and indifferent. When they criticize other people, we can stay indifferent, but as soon as we conclude that they're criticizing us, our self appears and immediately gets involved, and we immediately burn with defilement. Why? You have to pay close attention to this. As soon as your self arises, suffering arises in the very same instant. The same holds true even if you're just thinking. The self you think up spreads out into all sorts of issues. The mind gets scattered all over the place with defilement, craving, and attachments. It has very little mindfulness and discernment watching over it, so it gets dragged every which way by defilement and craving. And yet we don't realize it. We think we're just fine. Is there anyone among us who realizes that this is what's happening? We're too weighed down with our own delusions. No matter how much the mind is smothered in the defilement of delusion, we don't realize it, for it keeps us deaf and blind. There are no physical tools you can use to detect or cure this disease or defilement, because it arises only at sensory contact. There's no substance to it. It's like a match in a matchbox. As long as the match doesn't come into contact with the friction strip on the side of the box, it won't give rise to fire. But as soon as we strike it against the side of the box, it bursts into flame. If it goes out right then, all that gets burned is the matchbox. If it doesn't stop at the match head, it'll burn the matchstick. If it doesn't stop with the matchstick and meets up with anything flammable, it can grow into an enormous fire. When defilement arises in the mind, it starts from the slightest contact. If we can be quick to put it out right there, it's like striking a match that flares up, for an instant, and then dies down right in the match head. The defilement disbands right there, but if we don't put it out the instant it arises and let it start concocting issues, it's like pouring fuel into a fire. We have to observe the diseases of defilement in our own minds to see what their symptoms are, why they are so quick to flare up. They can't stand to be disturbed. The minute you disturb them, they flare up into flame. When this is the case, what can we do to prepare ourselves beforehand? How can we stock up on mindfulness before sensory contact strikes? The way to stock up is to practice meditation, as when we keep the breath in mind. This is what gets our mindfulness prepared so that we can keep ahead of defilement, so that we can keep it from arising as long as we have our theme of meditation as an inner shelter for the mind. The mind's outer shelter is the body, which is composed of physical elements, but its inner shelter is the theme of meditation we use to train its mindfulness to be focused and aware. Whatever theme we use in the inner shelter for the mind, that keeps it from wandering around, concocting thoughts and imaginings. This is why we need a theme of meditation. Don't let the mind chase after its preoccupations the way ordinary people who don't meditate do. Once we have a meditation theme to catch this monkey of a mind so that it becomes less and less willful day by day, it'll gradually calm down until it can stand firm for long or short periods, depending on how much we train and observe ourselves. Now, as for how we do breath meditation, the texts say to breathe in long and out long, heavy or light, and then to breathe in short and out short, again heavy or light. Those are the first steps of the training. After that, we don't have to focus on the length of the in-breath or out-breath. Instead, we simply gather our awareness at any point of the breath and keep this up until the mind settles down and is still. When the mind is still, you then focus on the stillness of the mind at the same time you're aware of the breath. At this point, you don't focus directly on the breath. You focus on the mind that's still and at normalcy. You focus continuously on the normalcy of the mind at the same time that you're aware of the breath coming in and out, without actually focusing on the breath. You simply stay with the mind, but you watch it with each in and out breath. Usually when you're doing physical work and your mind is at normalcy, you can know what you're doing, so why can't you be aware of the breath? After all, it's part of the body. Some of you are new to this, which is why you don't know how you can focus on the mind at normalcy with each in and out breath without focusing directly on the breath itself. What we're doing here is practicing how to be aware of the body and mind, pure and simple, in and of themselves. Start out by focusing on the breath for 5, 10, or 20 minutes. Breathe in long and out long, or in short and out short. At the same time, notice the stages and how the mind feels, how it begins to settle down when you have mindfulness watching over the breath. You've got to make a point of observing this, because usually you breathe out of habit with your attention far away. You don't focus on the breath. You're not really aware of it. This leads you to think that it's hard to stay focused here, but actually it's quite easy. After all, the breath comes in and out on its own accord, by its very nature. There's nothing at all difficult about breathing. It's not like other themes of meditation. For instance, if you're going to practice recollection of the Buddha or Buddho, you have to keep on repeating Buddho, Buddho, Buddho. Actually, if you want, you can repeat Buddho in the mind with each in and out breath, but only in the very beginning stages. You repeat Buddho to keep the mind from concocting thoughts about other things. Simply by keeping up this repetition, you can weaken the mind's tendency to stray, for the mind can take on only one object at a time. This is something you have to observe. The repetition is to prevent the mind from thinking up thoughts and clamoring after them. After you've kept up the repetition, you don't have to count the number of times. The mind will settle down to be aware of the breath with each in and out breath. It will begin to be still, neutral, at normalcy. This is when you focus on the mind instead of the breath. Let go of the breath and focus on the mind, but still be aware of the breath on the side. You don't have to make note of how long or short the breath is. Make note of the mind that stays at normalcy with each in and out breath. Remember this carefully so that you can put it into practice. The posture. For focusing on the breath, sitting is a better posture than standing, walking, or lying down, because the sensations that come with the other postures often overcome the sensations of the breath. Walking jolts the body around too much. Standing for a long time can make you tired, and if the mind settles down when you're lying down, you tend to fall asleep. With sitting, it's possible to stay in one position and keep the mind firmly settled for a long period of time. You can observe the subtleties of the breath and the mind naturally and automatically. Here I'd like to condense the steps of breath meditation to show how all 4 of the tetrads mentioned in the text can be practiced at once. In other words, is it possible to focus on the body, feelings, the mind, and the Dhamma all in one sitting? This is an important question for all of us. You could, if you wanted to, precisely follow all the steps in the text so as to develop strong powers of mental absorption, jhana. But it takes a lot of time. It's not appropriate for those of us who are old and have only a little time left. What we need is a way of getting our awareness at the breath long enough to make the mind firm and then go straight to examining how all fabrications are inconstant, stressful, and not self, so that we can see the truth of all fabrications with each in and out breath. If you can keep at this continually without break, your mindfulness will become firm and snug enough to give rise to the discernment that will enable you to gain clear knowledge and vision. So what follows is a guide to the steps in practicing condensed form of breath meditation. Give them a try until you find they give rise to knowledge of your own within you. You're sure to give rise to knowledge of your very own. The first thing when you're going to meditate on the breath is to sit straight and keep your mindfulness firm. Breathe in, breathe out. Make the breath feel open and at ease. Don't tense your hands, your feet, or any other joints at all. You have to keep your body in a posture that feels appropriate to your breathing. At the beginning, breathe in long and out long, fairly heavily, and gradually the breath will shorten, sometimes heavy, sometimes light. Then breathe in short and out short for about 10 or 15 minutes and then change. After a while, when you stay focused mindfully on it, the breath will gradually change. Watch it change for as many minutes as you like. Then be aware of the whole breath, all of its subtle sensations. This is the third step of the first tetrad, Sabba Kaya Patisangvedi, focusing on how the breath affects the whole body by watching all the breath sensations in all the various parts of the body, and in particular, the sensations related to the in and out breath. From there, you focus on the sensation of the breath at any one point. When you do this correctly for a fairly long while, the body, the breath, will gradually grow still. The mind will grow calm. In other words, the breath grows still together with the awareness of the breath. When the subtleties of the breath grow still at the same time that your undistracted awareness settles down, the breath grows even more still. All the sensations in the body gradually grow more and more still. This is the fourth step, the stilling of bodily fabrication. As soon as this happens, you begin to be aware of the feelings that arise with the stilling of the body and mind. Whether they are feelings of pleasure or rapture or whatever, they appear clearly enough for you to contemplate them. The stages through which you have already passed, watching the breath come in and out, long or short, should be enough to make you realize, even though you may not have focused on the idea that the breath is inconstant. It's continually changing from in long and out long to in short and out short, from heavy to light and so forth. This should enable you to read the breath, to understand that there's nothing constant to it at all. It changes on its own from one moment to the next. Once you have realized the inconstancy of the body, in other words, of the breath, you'll be able to see the subtle sensations of pleasure and pain in the realm of feeling. So now you watch feelings right there in the same place where you have been focusing on the breath. Even though there are feelings that arise from the stillness of the body or mind, they're nevertheless inconstant even in that stillness. They can change. So these changing sensations in the realm of feeling exhibit inconstancy in and of themselves, just like the breath. When you see change in the body, change in feelings, and change in the mind, this is called seeing the Dhamma, i.e., seeing inconstancy. You have to understand this correctly. Practicing the first tetrad of breath meditation contains all 4 tetrads of breath meditation. In other words, you see the inconstancy of the body and then contemplate feeling. You see the inconstancy of feeling and then contemplate the mind. The mind too is inconstant. This inconstancy of the mind is the Dhamma. To see the Dhamma is to see this inconstancy. When you see the true nature of all inconstant things, then keep track of that inconstancy at all times, with every in and out breath. Keep this up in all your activities to see what happens next. What happens next is dispassion, letting go. This is something you have to know for yourself. This is what condensed breath meditation is like. I call it condensed because it contains all the steps at once. You don't have to do one step at a time. Simply focus at one point, the body, and you'll see the inconstancy of the body. When you see the inconstancy of the body, you'll have to see feeling. Feeling will have to show its inconstancy. The mind's sensitivity to feeling, or its thoughts and imaginings, is also inconstant. All of these things keep on changing. This is how you know inconstancy. If you can become skilled at looking and knowing this way, you'll be struck with the inconstancy, stress, and not-selfness of your self, and you'll meet with genuine Dhamma. The Dhamma that's constantly changing like a burning fire, burning with inconstancy, stress, and not-self. It's the Dhamma of the impermanence of all fabrications. But further in the mind or in the property of consciousness is something special beyond the reach of any kind of fire. There's no suffering or stress of any kind at all. This thing that lies inside, you could say that it lies within the mind, but it isn't really in the mind. It's simply that the contact is there at the mind. There's no way you can really describe it. Only the extinguishing of all defilement will lead you to know it for yourself. This something special within exists by its very nature, but defilements have it surrounded on all sides. All these counterfeit things, the defilements, keep getting in the way and take possession of everything so that this special nature remains imprisoned inside at all times. Actually, there's nothing in the dimension of time that can be compared with it. There's nothing by which you can label it, but it's something that you can pierce through to see. In other words, by piercing through defilement, craving, and attachment into the state of mind that's pure, bright, and silent. This is the only thing that's important. But it doesn't have only one level. There are many levels, from the outer bark to the inner bark, and on to the sapwood before you reach the heartwood. The genuine Dhamma is like the heartwood, but there's a lot to the mind that isn't heartwood. The roots, the branches, and leaves of the tree are more than many, but there's only a little heartwood. The parts that aren't heartwood will gradually decay and disintegrate, but the heartwood doesn't decay. That's one kind of comparison we can make. It's like a tree that dies standing. The leaves fall away, the branches rot away, the bark and sapwood rot away, leaving nothing but the true heartwood. That's one comparison we can make with this thing we call deathless, this property that has no birth, no death, no changing. We can also call it nibbana, or the unfabricated. It's all the same thing. Now then, isn't this something worth trying to break through to see? Aware right at awareness. And this is, in this talk has the title of the book within it. The mind. If mindfulness and awareness are watching over it, won't meet with any suffering as the result of its actions. If suffering does arise, we'll be immediately aware of it and able to put it out. This is one point of the practice we can work at constantly, and we can test ourselves by seeing how refined and subtle our all-around awareness is inside the mind. Whenever the mind slips away and goes out to receive external sensory contact, can it maintain its basic stance of mindfulness or internal awareness? The practice we need to work at in our everyday life is to have constant mindfulness, constant, all-around present awareness like this. This is something we work at in every posture, sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. Make sure that your mindfulness stays continuous. Living in this world, the mental and physical phenomena of these 5 aggregates gives us plenty to contemplate. We must try to watch them, to contemplate them, so that we can understand them, because the truths we must learn how to read in this body and mind are here to be read with every moment. We don't have to get wrapped up with any other extraneous themes, because all the themes we need are right here in the body and mind. As long as we can keep the mind constantly aware of all around, we can contemplate them. If you contemplate mental and physical events to see how they arise and disband right in the here and now, and don't get involved with external things like sights, making contact with the eyes, or sounds with the ears, then there really aren't a lot of issues. The mind can be at normalcy, at equilibrium, calm and undisturbed by defilement or the stresses that come from sensory contact. It can look after itself and maintain its balance. You'll come to sense that if you're aware right at awareness in and of itself, without going out to get involved in external things like the mental labels and thoughts that will tend to arise, the mind will see their constant arising and disbanding and won't be embroiled in anything. This way it can be disengaged, empty, and free. But if it goes out to label things as good or evil, as me or mine, or gets attached to anything, it'll become unsettled and disturbed. You have to know that if the mind can be still, totally and presently aware, and capable of contemplating with every activity, then blatant forms of suffering and stress will dissolve away. Even if they start to form, you can be alert to them and disperse them immediately. Once you see this actually happening, even in only the beginning stages, it can disperse a lot of the confusion and turmoil in your heart. In other words, don't let yourself dwell on the past or latch onto thoughts of the future. As for the events arising and passing away in the present, you have to leave them alone. Whatever your duties, simply do them as you have to, and the mind won't get worked up about anything. It will be able to, at least some extent, to be empty and still. This one thing is something you have to be very careful about. You have to see this for yourself, that if your mindfulness and discernment are constantly in charge, the truths of the arising and disbanding of mental and physical phenomena are always there for you to see, always there for you to know. If you look at the body, you'll have to see it simply as physical properties. If you look at feelings, you'll have to see them as changing and inconstant, pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. To see these things is to see the truth within yourself. Don't let yourself get caught up with your external duties. Simply keep watch in this way inside. If your awareness is the sort that lets you read yourself correctly, the mind will be able to stay at normalcy, at equilibrium, at stillness, without any resistance. If the mind can stay with itself and not go out looking for things to criticize or latch onto, it can maintain a natural form of stillness. So this is something we have to try for in our every activity. Keep your conversations to a minimum, and there won't be a whole lot of issues. Keep watch right at the mind. When you keep watch at the mind and your mindfulness is continuous, your senses can stay restrained. Be mindful to keep watch in this way. Being mindful to keep watch in this way is something you have to work at. Try it and see. Can you keep this sort of awareness continuous? What sort of things can still get the mind engaged? What sorts of thoughts and labels of good and bad, me and mine, does it think up? Then look to see if these things arise and disband. The sensations that arise from external contact and internal contact all have the same sorts of characteristics. You have to look till you can see this. If you know how to look, you'll see it, and the mind will grow calm. So the point we have to practice in this later stage doesn't have a whole lot of issues. There's nothing you have to do, nothing you have to label, nothing you have to think a whole lot about. Simply look carefully and contemplate, and in this very lifetime, you'll have a chance to be calm and at peace, to know yourself more profoundly within. You'll come to see that the Dhamma is amazing right here in your own heart. Don't go searching for the Dhamma outside, for it lies within. Peace lies within, but we have to contemplate so that we're aware all around, subtly, deep down. If you look just on the surface, you won't understand anything. Even if the mind is at normalcy on the ordinary, everyday level, you won't understand much of anything at all. You have to contemplate so that you're aware all around in skillful ways. The word skillful is something you can't explain with words, but you can know for yourself when you see the way in which awareness within the heart becomes special. When you see that this special awareness, when you see that this special awareness is about, this is something you can know for yourself. And there's not really much to it, simply arising, persisting, disbanding. Look until this becomes plain, really, really plain, and everything disappears. All suppositions, all conventional formulations, all those aggregates and properties get swept away, leaving nothing but awareness, pure and simple, not involved with anything at all, and there's nothing you have to do to it. Simply stay still and watch, be aware, letting go with every moment. Simply watching this one thing is enough to do away with all sorts of defilements, all sorts of suffering and stress. If you don't know how to watch it, the mind is sure to get disturbed. It's sure to label things and concoct thoughts. As soon as there's contact at the senses, it'll go looking for things to latch onto, liking and disliking the objects it meets in the present, and then getting involved with the past and future, spinning a web to entangle itself. If you truly look at each moment in the present, there's really nothing at all. You'll see with every mental moment that things disband, disband, disband. Really nothing at all. The important point is that you don't go forming issues out of nothing. The physical elements perform their duties in line with their elementary physical nature. The mental elements keep sensing in line with their own affairs, but our stupidity is what goes looking for issues to cook up, to label, to think about. It goes looking for things to latch onto and then gets the mind into a turmoil. This point is all we really have to see for ourselves. This is the problem we have to solve for ourselves. If things are left to their nature, pure and simple, there's no us, no them. This is a singular truth that will arise for us to know and see. There's nothing else we can know or see that can match it in any way. Once you know and see this one thing, it extinguishes all suffering and stress. The mind will be empty and free, with no meanings, no attachments for anything at all. This is why looking inward is so special in so many ways. Whatever arises, simply stop still to look at it. Don't get excited by it. If you become excited when any special intuitions arise, when the mind is still, you'll get the mind worked up into a turmoil. If you become afraid that this or that will happen, that too will get you in a turmoil. So you have to stop and look, stop and know. The first thing is simply to look. The first thing is simply to know, and don't latch on to what you know, because whatever it is, it's simply a phenomena that arises and disbands, changing as part of its nature. So your awareness has to take a firm stance right at the mind, in and of itself. In the beginning stages, you have to know that when mindfulness is standing firm, the mind won't be affected by the objects of sensory contact. Keep working at maintaining this stance, holding firm to this stance. If you gain a sense of this for yourself, really knowing and seeing for yourself, your mindfulness will become even more firm. If anything arises in any way at all, you'll be able to let it go, and all the many troubles and turmoils of the mind will dissolve away. If mindfulness slips and the mind goes out giving meanings to anything, latching on to anything, troubles will arise. So you have to keep checking on this with every moment. There's nothing else that's so worth checking on. You have to keep check on the mind in and of itself, contemplating the mind in and of itself, or else you can contemplate the body in and of itself, feelings in and of themselves, or the phenomena of arising and disbanding, for example, the Dhamma in and of itself. All of these things are themes you can keep track of entirely within yourself. You don't have to keep track of a lot of themes, because having a lot of themes is what will make you restless and distracted. First, you'll practice this theme, then you'll practice that, then you'll make comparisons, all of which will keep the mind from growing still. If you can take your stance at awareness, if you're skilled at looking, the mind can be at peace. You'll know how things arise and disband. First, practice keeping awareness right within yourself so that your mindfulness can be firm, without being affected by the objects of sensory contact, so that it won't label things as good or bad, pleasing or displeasing. You have to keep checking to see that when the mind can be at normalcy, centered and neutral as its primary stance, then whatever it knows or sees, it will be able to contemplate and let go. The sensations in the mind that we explain at such length are still on the level of labels. Only when there can be awareness right at awareness will you really be able to know that the mind that is aware of awareness in this way doesn't send its knowing outside of this awareness. There are no issues. Nothing can be concocted in the mind when it knows in this way. In other words, an inward staying, unentangled knowing. All outward going knowing cast aside. An inward staying, unentangled knowing. All outward going knowing cast aside. The only thing you have to work at maintaining is the state of mind at normalcy, knowing, seeing, and still in the present. If you don't maintain it, if you don't keep looking after it, then when sensory contact comes, it will have an effect. The mind will go out with labels of good and bad, liking and disliking. So make sure you maintain the basic awareness that's aware right at yourself. And don't let there be any labeling. No matter what sort of sensory contact comes, you have to make sure that this awareness comes first. If you train yourself correctly in this way, everything will stop. You won't go straying out through your senses of sight, hearing, etc. The mind will stop and look, stop and be aware right at awareness, so as to know the truth that all things arise and disband. There's no real truth to anything. Only our stupidity is what latches onto things, giving them meanings and then suffering for it. Suffering because of its ignorance, suffering because of its unacquaintance with the five aggregates: form, feelings, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness, all of which are in constant, stressful, and not self. Use mindfulness to gather your awareness together, and the mind will stop getting unsettled, stop running after things. It will be able to stop and be still. Then make it know in this way, see in this way constantly, at every moment, with every activity. Work at watching and knowing the mind in and of itself. That will be enough to cut away all sorts of issues. You won't have to concern yourself with them. If the body is in pain, simply keep watch of it. You can simply keep watch of feelings in the body, because the mind that's aware of itself in this way can keep watch of anything within or without. Or it can simply be aware of itself to the point where it lets go of things outside, lets go of sensory contact, and keeps constant watch on the mind in and of itself. That's when you'll know that this is what the mind is like when it's at peace. It doesn't give meanings to anything. It's the emptiness of the mind, unattached, uninvolved, unconcerned with anything at all. These words, unattached, uninvolved, and unconcerned, are things you have to consider carefully, because what they refer to is subtle and deep. Uninvolved means uninvolved with sensory contact, undisturbed by the body or feelings. Unconcerned means not worried about past, future, or present. You have to contemplate these things until you know them skillfully, even though they're subtle. You have to contemplate them until you know them thoroughly. And don't go concerning yourself with external things, because they'll keep you unsettled, keep you running, keep you distracted with labels and thoughts of good and bad and all that sort of thing. You have to put a stop to these things. If you don't, your practice won't accomplish anything, because these things keep playing up to you and deceiving you. In other words, once you see anything, it will fool you into seeing it as right, wrong, good, bad, and so forth. Eventually, you have to come down to the awareness that everything simply arises, persists, and then disbands. Make sure you stay focused on the disbanding. If you watch just the arising, you may get carried off on a tangent, but if you go focus on the disbanding, you'll see emptiness. Everything is disbanding every instant. No matter what you look at, no matter what you see, it's there for just an instant and then disbands. Then it arises again, then it disbands. There's simply arising, knowing, disbanding. So let's watch what happens of its own accord, because the arising and disbanding that occurs by way of the senses is something that happens of its own accord. You can't prevent it. You can't force it. If you look and know it without attachment, there will be none of the harm that comes from joy or sorrow. The mind will stay in relative normalcy and neutrality. But if you're forgetful and start latching on, labeling things in pairs in any way at all, good and bad, happy and sad, pleasing and displeasing, the mind will become unsettled, no longer empty, no longer still. When this happens, you have to probe on to know why. All the worthless issues that arise in the mind have to be cut away. Then you'll find that you have less and less to say, less and less to talk about, less and less to think about. These things grow less and less on their own. They stop on their own. But if you get involved in a lot of issues, the mind won't be able to stay still. So we have to keep watching things that are completely worthless and without substance to see that they're not self. Keep watching them repeatedly, because your awareness, coupled with the mindfulness and discernment that will know the truth, has to see that this isn't myself. There's no substance or worth to it at all. It simply arises and disbands right here. It's here for just an instant, and then it disbands. All we have to do is stop and look, stop and know clearly in this way, and we'll be able to do away with many kinds of suffering and stress. The normal stress of the aggregates will still occur. We can't prevent it, but we'll know that it's the stress of nature and won't latch onto it as ours. So we keep watch of things that happen on their own. If we know how to watch, we keep watching things that happen on their own. Don't latch onto them as being you or yours. Keep this awareness firmly established in itself as much as you can, and there won't be much else you'll have to remember or think about. When you keep looking, keep knowing like this at all times, you'll come to see that there are no big issues going on. There's just the issue of arising, persisting, and disbanding. You don't have to label anything as good or bad. If you simply look in this way, it's no great weight on the heart. But if you go dragging in issues of good and bad, self, and all that, then suffering starts in a big way. The defilements start in a big way and weigh on the heart, making it troubled and upset. So you have to stop and look, stop and investigate, really deep down inside. It's like water covered with duckweed. Only when we take our hand to part the duckweed and take a look will we see that the water beneath is crystal clear. As you look into the mind, you have to part it. You have to stop. Stop thinking, stop labeling things as good or bad, stop everything. You can't go branding anything. Simply keep looking, keep knowing. When the mind is quiet, you'll see that there's nothing there. Everything is all still. Everything has all stopped inside. But as soon as there's labeling, even in the stillness, the stopping, the quiet, it will set things in motion. And as soon as things get set in motion, you don't know how to let go right from the start. Issues will arise, waves will arise. Once there are issues and waves, they strike the mind and it goes splashing all out of control. This splashing of the mind includes craving and defilement as well as avijja, ignorance. This all lies at its root. Our major obstacle is the aggregate of perceptions of labels. If we aren't aware of the arising and disbanding of perceptions, these labels will take hold. Perceptions are the chief instigators that label things within and without, so we have to be aware of their arising and disbanding. Once we're aware in this way, perceptions will no longer function as a cause of suffering. In other words, they won't give rise to any further thought fabrications. The mind will be aware in itself and able to distinguish these things in itself. So we have to stop things in the level of perception. If we don't, thought fabrications will fashion things into issues and then cause consciousness to wobble and waver in all sorts of ways. But these are things we can stop and look at, things we can know with every mental moment. If we aren't yet really acquainted with the rising and disbanding in the mind, we won't be able to let go. We can talk about letting go, but we can't do it because we don't know yet. As soon as anything arises, we grab hold of it, even when actually it's already disbanded. But since we don't really see, we don't know. So I ask that you understand this basic principle. Don't go grasping after this thing or that, or else you'll get yourself all unsettled. The basic theme is within. Look on in. Keep knowing on in until you penetrate everything. The mind will then be free from turmoil, empty, quiet, aware. So keep continuous watch of the mind in and of itself, and you'll come to the point where you simply run out of things to say. Everything will stop on its own, grow still on its own, because the underlying condition that is stopped and is still is already there. Simply, we aren't aware of it yet.